Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. Winters in the kingdom are quite long and very hard, and all because it snows almost non-stop. And that is why all the people of Florina, that abundant life and the light of spring, are worthy of good congratulations, and they always have some kind of feast there for the occasion. 3 years before the events that would take place afterward, the girl stood at her estate next to her father, who had summoned her since the morning. This girl's name was Chloe, and she was incredibly excited, so she didn't even immediately hear what he was talking about. So her father repeated, saying that she would marry Lord Cyril. He explained that Viscount Ornal was from a rather prestigious family, and their marriage to his son ensured that he would no longer be looked down upon. He also told the girl that they were giving her away with a pretty big devotee, so everything should go smoothly. But he asked that Chloe in no way make any mistake that would cause things to go south. Suddenly there was a knock at the manor, and the man said that he was introducing Lord Cyril, who had just come to see them. The girl was a little surprised that it would happen so quickly, but soon a blonde-haired guy walked in and bowed. He apologized and also told them his name. He stepped closer to the man and asked if he could find out where Lady Chloe was now. Then the girl curtsied, said she was incredibly honored to meet the Lord, and gave her name. Her father at this point clapped his hands and told the man that he was incredibly pleased and surprised that he had traveled such a long way on his own to come to see them in person. He also said that it was incredibly respectful to him. Yes, the thought that his daughter would be betrothed to the very son of the Viscount Arnalis. Chloe, however, was not as pleased as her father. She stood and looked at the man, realizing this thought that now he would be her husband. However, this Lord Cyril suddenly looked at Chloe, twisted his face and asked, "Who is this unattractive woman?" But her father at this point immediately said that this marriage was an incredible honor for their family, and he also promised that they would fully support them financially. Chloe immediately, as soon as she saw the look on her future husband's face, realized that he didn't care at all about their marriage. He didn't even like her as a person. And her father also added that his daughter has been really waiting for this day to finally meet him, and soon she really wants to get married after all. And so some more time has passed since then, and that long-awaited wedding day has finally arrived. When Chloe walked in her beautiful wedding dress and with a bouquet of roses to her groom, she was very upset. As soon as she stood next to the Lord, she immediately realized that he was completely unwilling to even look at her, which only made her feel worse. The ceremony was quite successful. However, it did not please Chloe, and all the pomp and decorations were just a formality for the guests. In the evening, when their wedding was over, the girl sat on the bed and suddenly saw how proud Cyril in only a robe began to approach her. Because she was still too young and had never been with men before, seeing him persistently walking straight towards her even made her a little embarrassed. She already thought something terrible was going to happen. But the man only walked around to the other side of her and lay down in bed to sleep. He hadn't said a single word to her since the wedding, and Chloe didn't understand why things were like this, not to mention the fact that he didn't touch her. So he was even afraid to look her directly in the eyes. Soon, a whole year of their married life had passed, and the girl arrived at her father's estate to visit him. However, he was no longer so happy to see her and asked, "Why don't they still have children?" Chloe became very bad because of this, and putting her head down, immediately asked her father for forgiveness. But she could not do anything about it, because her husband did not even want to say good morning to her. Soon after, her father visited her and the groom's parents, who also started yelling at her, saying they wanted to see their first grandchild as soon as possible. His mother also said that her task as a wife was to give their son an heir, and they were very indignant and distressed that she could not even manage such an easy task. Chloe was just depressed, and when she got home after all those trips, she turned to her husband, asking if he could make love to her with her so that she could have the baby already. But Lord Cyril only looked at her angrily, and with a heavy sigh, simply walked away. Of course, he ignored her offer and even began to mock her for suggesting such a thing in the first place. Chloe went up to her bedroom. She was all tearful because she didn't even know what to do now, because all the parents were pressuring her, but she couldn't do anything with her husband. The next morning when she woke up, she saw the empty bed beside her and realized that her husband hadn't even returned to the manor since the previous night. And just as the girl was about to leave to do her morning chores, the door suddenly opened, and Lord Cyril walked into the room. When she saw him, she was very surprised but also very happy. She immediately ran up to him and said that she was very happy to see him home again. However, her husband only passing by left behind him some strange scent, and Chloe, hearing it, immediately realized that it was some perfume of another woman. She immediately suspected something wrong. So after that incident, she went to his mother's estate and told her about it. The woman asked in surprise, "Does she really think he's having an affair on the side?" But then she got up from her seat and came closer to Chloe, and said that it was just a man's nature to have 2 or even 3 affairs at the same time. She explained to the poor and naive girl that it was quite normal. After all, they do not like this monogamy of family life. However, the woman also said that Chloe should not forget that it is her duty as a wife to lift his mood, so that he does not even think about other women. And she wondered for what reason they would still be born female, only to entertain their dear husbands and raise their heirs. Chloe was then incredibly amazed. After all, she also had her own thoughts and ambitions, and she realized that in no case could she let her spirit break. Of course, when the woman returned to the manor, all the maids and servants immediately began to mock her. After all, those rumors of his affair had already spread everywhere. There were no allies on her side. Chloe was left all alone in this world. No one supported her. Even her own father only demanded that she give birth to a child, and he didn't need anything else. And now, after a full 2 years and 11 months of their marriage together, the day of reckoning had finally arrived. One day, Lord Cyril came home and brought some blonde-haired girl with him. He told her something, but Chloe didn't listen to them at all. She was immersed in her thoughts, so she apologized to him and asked the man to repeat what he had said. Then the Lord began to shout, saying that he was filing for divorce from her, and also asked that the girl leave his estate immediately, for she no longer belonged in his house. When Chloe heard this, she was incredibly shocked. She didn't expect that these 2 years would be wasted, and he wouldn't love her, but would just find a replacement and kick her out. At that moment, she remembered the words of her father, who had always said that a woman should never cross a man. The Lord continued to yell at her, wondering, is there still nothing she wants to say to him? But even if she did, it still wouldn't help her. The decision had already been made, and she dared not challenge it. So he asked that the girl hurry up as soon as possible, because he doesn't want to see her anymore. And he also added that he already told all the news to his parents, so they are already aware of it. He embraced his mistress, who at that moment was already pregnant by him, and said that unlike Chloe, the girl had never in these almost 3 years given him an heir, and therefore she simply had no right to bear the title of his wife. He then handed her some paper, saying it was a medical certificate that confirmed his theory that she was infertile. And Chloe, when she heard this, was incredibly surprised. She immediately took this paper in her hands and began to scrutinize it to see if it was true. The Lord in turn smiled and also said that usually a request for divorce is never granted, and the exception is if the woman is infertile, only then they can file for divorce. So he smilingly told Chloe that women like her couldn't have children, which meant they couldn't even call themselves women at all. Chloe was incredibly stunned by the information she heard and couldn't even say anything back to him. Her husband in turn added that she should take all her belongings and leave as soon as possible. However, with a smile on his face, he also added that he would leave her devoted self as compensation for all these years. At that moment, the girl rose from her seat. She was trembling from the emotions that overwhelmed her. Chloe, bowing, said that she understood everything perfectly. So soon she went to her room to pack her things to leave the estate. As soon as she got home, her father was furious. He called her a foolish girl and even wanted to hit her for passing up such an incredible opportunity to live with a lord. He couldn't believe that his daughter was really infertile, and he didn't understand how she could ever dishonor him and their entire family like this. Her father also asked if Chloe even realized how much money they had lost because of all this, because her dowry was quite expensive. In addition, he kept making special payments to them, so that the Lord would only keep the girl. As he left, he also said that she could never marry again, because she was ugly and couldn't even have children. She is simply worthless in this world. Turning to Chloe, he said that in that case he had nothing else to do but to send her to a convent for the rest of her days. Because of how worthless she was, all she had left to do, in his opinion, was cut off her hair and pray to God all day long. So he gave her 1 month to prepare for this trip. Chloe was just depressed at the time. However, Because of her father's arguments, she also thought that it made sense, and thought that it would really be better for everyone. She thought that if all she had to do was pray facing God, she would no longer have to interact with other people. This meant that no one would be able to deceive her or betray her and hurt her incredibly badly in the process. Chloe really thought she could live there in peace and tranquility, so she accepted her fate as it was. And from that moment, a whole week passed. The girl woke up early in the morning, brushed her beautiful hair, and realized that if she went to the monastery, she would really have to cut it off, because it is not customary to go there with such long and beautiful hair. However, it was quite hard for her to do it, because she had always loved her beautiful hair very much, which made her beautiful. Chloe hesitated for a while, but then she realized that before her regrets became even greater, she had to do it right now with her own hands, because otherwise it would only hurt more. So she picked up the scissors she had on her desk and was about to do this incredible deed. But then she stopped suddenly, for she heard a carriage approaching their estate. It interested her at once. The girl immediately ran to the window, not realizing who could have come to visit them suddenly so early, and even without warning. At this very moment, the coachman of the wagon immediately ran into the manor, and after saying hello to Chloe's father, told him the whole situation. The girl herself went back to cutting her hair as her father suddenly burst into the room. She looked at him in surprise and came closer, wondering if he had something wrong, since he never usually came into her room. However, he in turn simply said that they had found her a new husband. When Chloe heard this, she was very surprised and asked him what he was saying, but he only replied that a messenger had come from the Marquis of Roland to ask for her marriage, and that a carriage would come the next day to take her to the right place. So he asked that the girl prepare in advance for all this and make a good impression. When Chloe heard about the Marquis of Roland, she was just furious. She ran to her father and asked him not to do it. She was even ready to beg him to send her straight to the convent, because she had already made this decision. But her father started yelling at her, saying that she has no say in such decisions, and what he says is what she should carry out. Chloe turned to him in a trembling voice, for she realized that this Marquis was simply a terrible man. In fact, Marquis Roland de Grasse is the head of the House of Grasse, and he is a shrewd businessman, a lord who has made a vast fortune. He had oversight over the management of wine and grain throughout the kingdom. He had eyes absolutely everywhere. Some even speculate that Florina can only be grateful to Lord Gras and the efforts he made. However, even this praise is overshadowed by the dark rumors that have been circulating about him. Chloe knew that this Lord Grasse was much older than she was, and was already a widower at that age. It is natural for a man who is left a widower to have his spouse die, but in his case it was not one wife, but as many as 3. Lord Grasse's first wife died of illness, his second wife was killed in an accident, and the third wife mysteriously disappeared. None of his wives died under ordinary circumstances of old age or anything else. Of course, it is likely that no one suspected what caused his first wife to die, for disease can kill anyone. However, after that incident with his third wife, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he had done something bad to her. It's certainly possible. Doesn't mean anything, as it is a mere rumor. However, it is likely that it could actually be true. And if that's true, then Chloe is just his next victim. So the girl tried with all her might to persuade her father not to give her in marriage to this man, but rather to send her to a convent or somewhere else. But her father began to shout at her, saying that he had no voice in the matter, for the Baron could not ask another request of the Marquis, and what the Marquis said was the law. And adjusting his clothes, he said that in any case his lordship had said that he did not require a dowry, and their house could only accept the offer on such a condition. Chloe was just depressed. She was lying on the floor and did not understand how she should be, and her father did not stop repeating to her that she should realize that she was a disgrace to their house and family. He looked at his daughter in disgust and said she should still be grateful that they had found someone who could take her in at all. Then Chloe could not stand it, and crying in a trembling voice, told her father that she understood everything. She had no time left. She carried on going against her father's will. As she was then told, the next day the Marquis of Grasse's carriage came for the girl at once in the morning. She had managed to gather a few of her things. There were some books and jewelry that had been left behind. It all fit into a small suitcase, which she took with her. As soon as Chloe went downstairs, she saw her father talking to the coachman and thanked him for everything. She immediately went to her father to say goodbye. He didn't even want to look at her, but went back to the manor. After that, Chloe got into the wagon and went on a journey unknown to her. As soon as the girl began to drive away from their estate, she saw her younger brother and mother in the window. She thought about Marius staying there and realized that it was okay, because he was the heir to the family. And that meant he would be treated well. She wished her brother to grow strong and healthy, and to take care of himself as best he could. From her estate, the wagon traveled through several dense forests and endless plains, and after a full week of travel, they finally arrived at Grass Manor. As soon as Chloe stepped out of the wagon, she saw the incredibly large building in front of her. It took her breath away, and she didn't expect to see such a large estate. She looked at the manor for a while and was about to enter, but then suddenly, various servants and maids immediately ran up to her. The girl was very surprised. Everyone began to greet her immediately and talked about how happy they were to see her. One of the maids said that Chloe looked like such a kind and confident girl. The other one was about to compliment her, but suddenly another voice was heard. A man in a suit came out to them and, bowing, said he was pleased to welcome Chloe to their estate. It was the butler, and smiling, he told the girl that she could pass, for the master of the house was already waiting for her. Chloe was incredibly surprised, so she couldn't even move. Everyone welcomed her with such joy and friendliness. She had never seen such a thing in her whole life. As soon as she stepped inside, the maid immediately went to fetch her and asked that she hand them her coat and walk to the living room, settling in properly. Chloe could not believe that they were really happy to see her in the manor and were waiting for her. She didn't expect such a friendly greeting. She had expected that as soon as she arrived, she would immediately find herself in another circle of hell. But things turned out quite differently. For some time, she sat in the parlor, waiting for the master of the manor to come to her. And soon a man in a black mask came into her room. It was the master of the house, Roland de Grasse. As soon as she saw that black mask and basically his outfit, she immediately knew that the rumors were indeed true. In order to hide his burn wound, which he received as a very young boy, the man never takes off his black mask, and some people even talk about his face being more like an animal's. Chloe immediately stood up to greet him. However, from surprise, she couldn't even say a single word. Certainly she could not compliment him, as his mask perfectly hid his ugly face. But still something had to be said, so gathering her courage, she finally spoke. The girl said she was incredibly excited to finally meet him, and she was honored, and introduced herself. The man didn't say anything to that, but just stood there looking at her for a while. Chloe became completely uncomfortable. She didn't understand what she had done wrong and what she should do next, because he didn't want to answer her at all. She looked around the room for a while, confused. Then she turned to the man, calling him her town. As soon as Roland heard this, he angrily asked her what she was saying. The girl immediately repeated what she had said before. She immediately replied that if it was really inappropriate, she could call him something else, and asked what he would prefer. It was incredibly strange for the man to see such behavior, and he told her to just call him by his first name. Chloe still felt it was too inappropriate to call him that, so she suggested that she might call him Lord Roland. He was satisfied with that answer, so he agreed that she could call him that. So immediately afterward, he turned his head aside, and Chloe, moving closer, wondered if he had something going on. But the man did not answer anything, only abruptly took a step back. The girl was very surprised, and she didn't understand why he was suddenly leaving her. Roland immediately said that nothing happened, adding that the wedding will take place in 3 days. He also suggested that the girl was probably very tired from the road, so she could safely go and rest in her room. Chloe was a little embarrassed by such a conversation. However, she thanked him wholeheartedly for it. At that moment, someone suddenly knocked on their door, and Roland immediately allowed them to enter. Then the butler came into the room and apologized for disturbing them. But then he turned to Mrs. Chloe and said that he wanted to check something with her. He explained that he wanted to bring her luggage into the room so she wouldn't bother, and wondered if that small suitcase was the only thing she had brought with her. The girl immediately became uncomfortable with this, and her face flushed a little. and Roland in turn angrily inquired whether it was really true that she had brought only one suitcase with her. He passed by, saying that she was, after all, the daughter of a baron, and he did not understand where her various jewelry and fine dresses were. He also wondered if she had left everything in her closet and come with absolutely nothing. But the girl looked down and said that it was all her clothes and outfits. And it really was. An ordinary noblewoman's daughter would have had her own dowry, and she would have brought it with her to her new husband. It would have been quite natural to bring in a great many different things. However, when she married Lord Cyril, that's where all her things were. After their divorce, however, he kept everything. Chloe knew very well that her father wasn't going to spend extra money on her to buy her more outfits, and that was why that small suitcase was all she took with her. The girl put her head down, and in a trembling voice asked them to apologize. However, Roland replied that she shouldn't do that, because he didn't want to scold her and tear her down, but just thought it was rather strange. He calmed down a bit and moved closer to the girl and wondered what she had brought with her in such a case. Chloe immediately replied that she had brought along a necklace that she had gotten from her grandmother, as well as some books that she loved very much. As soon as Roland heard about books, he was immediately interested and wondered if she liked to read. Chloe, upon hearing him ask this, immediately lit up with joy and said that she loved books incredibly, even though she didn't have the opportunity to read as much as she would have liked. The man replied that he understood that, and Chloe herself was contentedly surprised at how interested he was in her hobbies and life. Apart from her grandmother, who died when the girl was still very young, no one looked after her interests, and it was the first time in a very long time that anyone had asked Chloe what she liked to do. For a while, Roland just stood there looking at her. After that, he turned around and said that he would talk to her a little later. Soon after that, the girl already came to her bedroom. It was already quite dark outside, so she immediately changed her clothes and lay down to sleep. But as soon as she tried to do so, she still couldn't, for she wondered why the man was so upset that she had arrived with only one suitcase. She even suggested that perhaps he was tired of entertaining a wife who was without a devotee and didn't even have her own possessions. Chloe could not understand why he decided to marry a woman like her, without any good looks or even status. She thought she would be treated in this place the same way she was treated at Arnold's house. However, this was not the case at all. Every staff in this house welcomed her. And yes, on top of that, this beautiful and expensive room belonged entirely to her. But she realized that with the wedding coming up in 3 days, she couldn't be sure things would stay the same. Anything could happen, and she doesn't want to imagine very much, only to be disappointed in her expectations later. She doesn't want to die of sadness and longing anymore. The next morning, a maid came in and began measuring various parts of Chloe's body, telling her that she should take those measurements for her wedding dress. Once everything was finished, the girl said with an excited expression on her face that usually the wedding dress takes at least a month. However, this time it would be ready on time. The girl shouldn't even worry about it. She also added that they have already prepared the necessary materials, so they will be able to do all the tailoring even in 1 day. As soon as Chloe heard about these deadlines, she was very surprised. She couldn't believe that they could manage so quickly, and she immediately wondered how much the servants should take up with this dress. Oh, she began to imagine how much money it would cost to do all this work. But then suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was the butler, and he asked if he could come in. She was a little surprised that someone was coming so early and asking for permission, but she said that of course he could come in. Then the butler came into the room, and several other servants behind him, all holding huge boxes that were very nicely packed. He apologized to her for this sudden intrusion. When Chloe saw all this, she was very surprised, and all the house staff immediately started putting boxes in her room. The girl couldn't believe this was really happening, and she could hardly think that all these things were for her. When the boxes were brought in, the butler, coughing, pointed to the side, saying that the 4 boxes contained hats for each season. After that, he moved his hand to the other side, saying that those 3 small boxes had pearlized hair accessories in them, as well as a necklace and earrings. He then pointed to another part of the room, saying that those 4 rather large boxes had in them coats and a dress, which had been selected especially for walking, And in all the others, he said, are 4 reference books and several novels, which she should read, in the opinion of the gentleman. Chloe listened carefully to the butler, was very surprised, and apologizing, asked what it was all for. He had already smiled and said that it was so that she would have her dowry, and these things are what they are. She, on hearing this, was very much surprised, and, looking carefully at the butler, asked, "Is it really true?" The man smiled in return and bowed with the rest of the servants, saying that Lord Roland had sent all this for her, and also apologized that there wasn't as much stuff as he would have liked. However, Chloe, interrupting him at once, said that it was not so at all, and there were, on the contrary, even more than necessary. In fact, she was very surprised and embarrassed, because it was the first time she had ever received so many gifts at one time, and such expensive ones too. She stood looking at all the boxes for a while. Then she asked the butler if she could see what was inside. He came closer and said that of course she could, for it all belonged to her now. Chloe went at once to the little square boxes which the butler had said contained the books, and taking out one of them, looked at the whole thing in surprise. She held an incredibly beautiful red-covered book in her hands, and as she ran her finger over it, she smelled the incredibly lovely scent of freshly printed paper. Chloe couldn't even think of ever having the chance to read one new book, and she immediately hugged it like it was the most precious thing she'd ever had. The girl immediately thought that she should immediately thank Lord Roland for all these gifts, and also tell him how happy she was to find herself at his place. So looking at the book some more, she turned to the butler, inquiring where Roland was at that moment. The man replied that at that moment Lord Roland was studying and he would soon have a break, so he asked if the girl would allow him to escort her to him. Chloe was immediately happy, and they went together to the study, where Roland was sitting behind various papers and textbooks. After a while, they came to the office and knocked on the door. The man immediately answered that they could come in. Just then, Chloe came into his room and, bowing, stepped closer to him. The man immediately got up from his seat and looked rather worried. He looked at her and asked, "Did she have something wrong or a problem?" However, the girl replied that she was fine, and also explained that she had come to thank him. She looked at him with an incredibly joyful look and said, "Thank you for giving her all those beautiful and expensive gifts he gave her." He then asked in surprise, "Have they finally arrived?" He also said that he hoped she would like them all, for he had spent a long time selecting them. Chloe immediately smiled and said that of course she loved everything. Those dresses and coats with jewelry were incredible. But then suddenly she lowered her voice a little and looked down and said that the thing that made her happiest was a book. Then the girl inquired of Lord Roland, did he really personally pick up all those books he donated? He was silent for a while, and then he said that of course he'd picked everything out, and he hoped she'd like them, because they must be pretty good stories. He got a little embarrassed and also said that he didn't know what kind of books a young lady like her might like, and so he was rather in a quandary when he picked them out for her. Chloe put her head down and, after thinking about her answer for a bit, said that they all looked incredibly interesting, and they were new to her, so she would be incredibly excited to read them and find out what stories they held. Roland, hearing this, calmed down a little and wondered, did it really make her so happy? But without waiting for her response, he began to step aside, saying that they were gifts to welcome her to his new estate. He also asked that she should never hesitate to ask for more even after their marriage. He took his seat back at the table and said he would buy her lots of books if she liked them, so she could feel at ease and start reading one by one. Chloe was very surprised by such generosity, but thanked him for such an opportunity. She had never been told such words before, let alone given such gifts. Soon afterward, the butler began to take her back to her room, and she walked in silence, thinking all the while of Lord Roland. This poor man has earned himself a reputation as a wife killer, and surely it is really strange that he wears a dark mask without taking it off. However, she is sure that deep in his heart he may be a kind and decent man, and so as she begins to get to know him a little better, she even becomes ashamed of how she was quick to believe all those horrible rumors that had been going around about this man. And so she wants to learn even more about him, in order to understand what kind of person he really is. Soon after, the butler brought the girl to the dining room. A maid came in and bowed to her and told her that they had already prepared her food. Immediately afterward, the maid began to bring out her plate of supper, and Chloe, looking at it anxiously, wondered if Lord Roland would not be with her this evening. The maid immediately said not at all, and she was sorry to say it, but he was too busy with his studies, so he must skip dinner. Chloe was a little disappointed by this, and putting her head down she said that she understood, and after that she began to eat her dinner, which was incredibly beautiful and luxurious, as was everything in that manner. Immediately after eating, she went to her room and began to read the book she had been given. However, for quite a large amount of time she could not concentrate on the letters that were written, for she kept thinking that she wished Roland would join her at dinner so that she could talk to him. She's surprised that he's so busy that he doesn't even have time for dinner, but she realizes that she can't talk to him for very long, because he has a lot of things to do as a nobleman. And the whole situation reminded her that she had forgotten to tell Lord Roland something very important. She'd been married once before, but she'd never had experience with intimate things before, and she hadn't told a man about it. Chloe realized that he already knew that this was her second marriage, and she must have some experience. However, all this was completely different, because her previous husband had hardly ever even spoken to her. The girl was very alarmed, so she immediately threw the book aside and, crying, realized that she must certainly warn him about it. Several days have passed since then, and now finally, the day of Lord and Chloe's wedding has arrived. The girl woke up quite early to be ready in time for the ceremony. The maids helped her put on a beautiful dress and arrange her hair. Soon they left her alone, and after a while a maid came in, bowed, and told Chloe that it was time to begin the ceremony. Chloe was actually quite excited, even though she was wearing an incredibly fantastic dress that, as promised, had been made in just a day. However, the girl still wasn't sure it was suitable for someone like her, for she was too plain and low in rank for something like this. As she closed her eyes, she realized that none of this was good. She knew she had to move on, but she still couldn't forget her first marriage, and the words Lord Cyril had said when he'd first seen her. But then, suddenly all her terrible thoughts were interrupted by a maid who took her hand and asked if they could leave already. Chloe was still worried for a while, but then answered that they could go because they could not be late. And so when she came downstairs, she bowed immediately when she saw someone walk past them. When she took a closer look, she realized that it was Lord Roland, and he was also incredibly beautifully dressed. The man was wearing a fine, expensive white suit with blue inserts, and of course he still wore his black mask. However, it fit his image perfectly. Chloe was even a little embarrassed because she thought that against his background she looked even more terrible. So she lowered her head and didn't even say hello to him. She moved closer to him and realized that he hadn't said much lately, so the girl was incredibly curious as to what he was even thinking at this moment. Chloe even suggested that he must be tired of her by now, because she was so plain, even in that dress, and simply unworthy of him. The girl blushed more and more and tried to hold back her tears, thinking that he probably even regretted taking her as his wife. But then suddenly Lord Roland came closer to her and said in a quiet voice that she looked stunning. The girl, when she heard this, immediately looked up and decided to ask him again just in case, for she thought she had just imagined it. But the man was embarrassed, for he had not expected to say it aloud. So he turned around abruptly and said that it was time for them to go. Chloe stood behind him for a while longer and couldn't believe that he had really said those words. She blushed even more with embarrassment and suggested that he thought she was rather pretty. Soon they traveled to the altar where the priest was already waiting for them to seal their marriage before God. However, the entire church was completely empty. No one from her family attended this wedding ceremony, nor was there any family or friends on the groom's side as guests. The attendees were for the most part servants of the manor. Chloe was very surprised that, unlike her first marriage, the seats were completely empty, because at that wedding, there were a lot of guests she didn't even know. But this time it was a simple ceremony where they vowed to love each other forever in front of the priest and some guests. When the vows were said, Lord Roland leaned closer to her and kissed her directly on the lips to seal their marriage. As soon as they did so, all the servants immediately stood up and began to loudly applaud and congratulate the newlyweds. But at that moment, Chloe's heart felt something unusual, something she had never felt before, and the girl began to smile happily, even though she was very embarrassed. Soon afterward, they held hands and began to leave the church. Everyone continued to applaud and congratulate, showering the newlyweds with rose petals. The wedding ceremony was over rather quickly, unlike her first marriage, and Lord Roland, along with Chloe, came into the bedroom to spend their wedding night. The girl sat on the bed and did not understand what she should do, for she had never found an opportunity to tell him about her situation. Chloe was going to tell him right before their wedding, but she couldn't find time alone with him beforehand, because all the time there were servants around to separate them. The girl simply had no choice, so she was going to tell him everything the moment he walked into the bedroom. Sighing heavily, she realized that she also had to tell him that she had never been with a man yet. And at that moment, suddenly the door opened. The man was in one robe and, coming closer to her, sat down next to her on the bed. The atmosphere was contentedly tense for Chloe, and she thought about what she should tell him right then. And then, as she raised her head to say something, Roland put his hand on her cheek and pulled her face closer to his for a kiss. The girl was even more nervous and thought about how she needed to hurry up before this whole thing started. So before he could kiss her, she turned to him. Chloe said she owed him something before any of this happened, but the man didn't want to hear anything and said he'd talk to her later. She continued to get even more nervous and said she had to say it right now. And just as she was about to start talking about her previous husband, something unexpected happened. Lord Roland immediately moved over to the girl and began kissing her on the lips while gently laying her on the bed. Chloe tried to say something to him, but it was useless because the man continued to kiss her without stopping. He kissed her gently on the lips for a while, and then pulled back and said that he absolutely didn't want to hear about her previous husband right now. Chloe replied that she didn't want to talk about him at all either, but it was a very important thing, and she owed it to him to warn him. But the girl had no time to finish the sentence, for Roland leaned close to her and said that the only person she should think of this evening was he. And without letting her say another word, he started kissing her on the lips again. Then he wrapped his arms around her waist and put her on the bed a little higher, against the pillows. Without wasting time, Roland immediately ran up and continued kissing her. Chloe thought at that moment that he was quite strong, and even assumed that those rumors about his wife's murder were true, because he could do such a thing for sure. They continued kissing, and everything around them became much hotter. The girl realized then that it was getting harder and harder for her to think clearly. These new and unusual emotions were overwhelming her completely. Suddenly, she felt like she couldn't even breathe anymore, so she tried to pull the man away from her. But he grabbed her hands and held them higher so tightly she couldn't even move them. He then looked her straight in the eyes and began to repeat her name over and over, while kissing her red face with his soft lips. After that, he moved to her lips again and didn't stop. And the girl didn't understand what it felt like. Tears even came to her eyes. Certainly she wasn't sure at first, but after a while of more kisses like this, she realized that she wanted him to keep touching her. They kissed passionately on the lips for a while longer, and then he began to lick her tears that were running down her cheeks with his tongue. Chloe immediately pulled away from him and said that it tickled a lot. However, he in turn started hugging her hard and kissing her neck. The girl began to blush even more, and told Lord Roland that she could no longer breathe, so she asked that he let her go. For a while more the man hugged her, and after that he said he didn't want to do it. He also had tears running down his eyes. He lay there contemplating her body for a while, and then he began to remove her nightgown from her. Chloe was immediately embarrassed, and when she was left completely naked, she began to cover her body with her hands, asking him to stop doing that. But he in turn began to remove his robe, exposing himself as well. Roland was left with only his mask. The girl, seeing this, immediately began to turn away from him and asked him not to look at her so much. But the man at that moment grabbed her hand and started touching her delicate places. The girl was incredibly embarrassed and didn't understand why he was doing all this. After that, however, he suddenly went even lower. Roland ran his fingers gently down her legs and then opened them. When Chloe saw it, she immediately started screaming, begging him to stop looking there and doing all that. She even covered her face with her hands. The man just stared for a while, and afterwards said he had a feeling she was still a virgin. The girl didn't say anything to that, but just turned around in the other direction. She was incredibly embarrassed by the whole situation. Roland was silent for a while, and then he said that she was now his wife, and he wanted to make her completely forget about her previous husband. And that's when he did it. The girl even screamed in surprise, but in spite of all that, it felt good. Roland looked at her for a while, and afterward he called her his dear Chloe, and said he wanted to make every part of her his own. He continued to make her feel good and asked what was best for her, But in the end, Chloe couldn't stand it and started pushing him away from her. But he suddenly grabbed her hand and said that she was some very stubborn girl, for she was still trying to escape. He then took her by the leg and asked her if she still thought so much about her previous husband. Chloe was all red and crying, appealed to Lord Roland to stop doing all this already. But the man wasn't going to stop. All he was saying was that it made him feel good that she was calling his name, so he wanted her to keep it that way. Chloe was talking about how much it hurt, so she asked for him to stop. She was already starting to cry hard. When he heard this, he looked at her in surprise and asked her what she even meant and how long ago it had been. The girl continued to be in incredible pain and asked him to slow down. But Roland looked at her and said he couldn't stop right now, so he continued with even more intensity. It went on for quite some time, and the girl didn't even know how much time had passed since they started all this. She just lost track of time. Soon after it was over, she was lying in bed and couldn't even move. Chloe wasn't even sure if she could sleep at all after everything that had happened. Roland was lying on the bed beside her, and he put his arm around her and pulled her closer to him, wondering if she was awake yet. The girl did not answer, but stared silently into the distance. He was a little angry and asked her why she was silent. She thought at that moment that she was incredibly tired and felt a strong heaviness in her limbs, so much so that she couldn't even move. But then suddenly the man stood up and rolled her over onto her back, telling her to look directly at him. They were still unclothed, so he began kissing all over her body and moving his hands lower and lower. Chloe looked at him in surprise and asked, "Does he really want to do it again?" But then, she gave in to those feelings and felt something mixed with pain and pleasure again. She kept calling out his name and it made him even more pleased and happy. So he started hugging her tightly at that. When morning came, Roland woke up first because the girl still had no energy left after that night. Afterward, the man did all his morning chores and went to the study to study. Immediately afterward, the butler came to him and asked the man in astonishment what he had done with Lady Chloe. Roland answered nothing, but remained silent. Then the butler, unable to bear it, began to shout very loudly, repeating the same question over and over again. He also said that she has been bedridden since last night with a huge fever and can't even get up. After calming down a bit, he exhaled and said that this was his long-awaited wife, after all. It was the first time she appeared young and came to their estate. However, everything happened in such a way. He turned to the Lord again and began to shout, asking if he even realized how happy he was to serve such a kind and pure woman like her. The man was silent for a while. Then Roland turned to Gaston and said that Chloe was much nicer than he had imagined. He lowered his head and turned her away from Gaston, saying that she was incredibly nice, but there was nothing he could do to help. The butler kept shouting, telling his lord that he thought he was definitely to blame for the situation. Roland was silent for a while, then said that the boy is indeed right. He is a terrible villain who stole her innocence in such a cruel way. Gaston exhaled and asked the man to take the matter very seriously. But then he suddenly realized what the gentleman was talking about, and wondered what he was even talking about. Roland, leaning back in the back of his chair, said that was right. She was completely innocent. He also explained that this morning the doctor had confirmed his suspicion, for the blood that had been left on the sheets was just such a confirmation. When the butler heard this, he was very surprised and asked, "How is that possible? After all, she had already been married for 3 whole years before coming to their estate." Gaston couldn't believe what the gentleman meant, that the previous husband had never even touched her before. Roland, sighing, replied that he had been told that Chloe couldn't have a child. However, if it was natural that a virgin could not bear heirs. He, smiling, also added that this is God's work, and he alone is the witness in all this. Roland had already replied that he thought it was part of a grand scheme to save her dowry. After all, if she was infertile, she could divorce and keep all the money. He had also heard that the Arnuli household was in financial difficulties, and if Chloe was barren, there would be no man willing to marry her after the divorce, and it would be only natural to send her to a convent, even if the girl ended up marrying, which would only be a relief to the elderly widower. Roland went to the window and looked out there and said, speaking otherwise, under normal circumstances, the deception would never have been discovered. The guy also added that if he's being honest, he's even very happy that this hoax they had succeeded. He picked up a chamomile that stood nearby and, smelling it, said that even though it had taken quite a while, Chloe had eventually become his wife. However, the facts remain that that cowardly man tried to ruin the young girl's life, and he almost succeeded in doing so. This made Roland incredibly angry, and he said that this world is filled with men who don't consider others as anything but their mistresses. At this very time, Chloe was still lying in bed and just burning up from the temperature she had. The girl had a nightmare about running through the woods and someone chasing her, even almost catching up with her. Then suddenly some man ran out towards her and, interrupting those villains, turned to her, inquiring if she was all right. Chloe, who had been screaming for help before, looked at the man and remembered that it was a memory from her childhood. The man then said that actually everything is absolutely fine now and she shouldn't be afraid. But the girl began to doubt and wondered, is it really true? Is it really all right? The man replied that this was indeed the case and began to pull her to him. She said she was incredibly happy and realized that this was really the man she'd been thinking about. The girl woke up briefly, but after that she drifted back into sleep. Still too weak, she said something about it all being true, not a fairy tale. Soon afterward, Chloe's fever finally broke, and her health began to slowly return. It had been a full week since then. In the evening, having gone about all his business, Roland came to the girl's room with a bouquet of flowers and a sign of apology. As soon as Chloe saw him, she immediately bowed as she sat on the bed and said that she apologized for what happened last week. She also added that she was absolutely sure that it was very unkind of her for passing out. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what she was even saying. But Chloe, as if she didn't hear him, said that this day she would try to do everything possible to stay awake until the end. She was already blushing, seeing could only imagine what she would have to endure. She asked for him to forgive her, but Roland at that moment immediately said that it was completely different from what he had planned this evening. Therefore, she shouldn't bother. Then he handed her bouquets of flowers, shining them next to her on the bed, and said they were special for her. The girl, when she saw them, immediately picked them up and said they were incredibly beautiful. And she thought about the fact that it was the first time a man had ever given her such a beautiful bouquet of flowers, or flowers in general. They were silent for some time, and then Roland, lowering his gaze, said that he would like to apologize to her first. After all, he couldn't even imagine that she was still a completely innocent girl. He said, bowing, that he should have listened to her then, and he was well aware that a simple apology would be utterly insufficient, for she had suffered such a horror through his fault. When Chloe heard this, she was incredibly surprised that he was apologizing to her, and didn't even know how she should react to it. So she immediately asked that he raise his head to begin with. Roland did, and she replied that she should apologize to him, because she was his wife, so he could do absolutely anything he wanted with her. It was her responsibility. As soon as he heard that, he immediately began to imagine many different vulgarities, but quickly pushed those thoughts away from him, and said it was absolutely not the right thing for him to do, because she's a human being too and deserves the right to choose in her point of view. He also added that a husband should not treat his wife like this. He is well aware that his actions are far from matching his words. However, he really wants them to be equal partners, and at that moment, he took her hand as a sign of his true feelings. Putting his head down, he said that was why he would not make love to her again until she herself gave him permission to do so, and until she herself wanted to do so. He asked that she be comfortable in this house, for he did not want her to live all her best years as a penal servitude. Chloe looked at him in love. Then she took her hand away, saying he was incredibly kind to her. They were silent for a while, and then the man asked if he could ask her something. The girl immediately waved her head in agreement, and Roland immediately inquired why she had been innocent until then, as well as how she had been treated by her previous husband. He, after examining her from head to toe, also said that she was rather thin, and inquired whether he had fed her at all. The girl was immediately uncomfortable with the question, and she looked down, not knowing how to answer him. He immediately took her hand and, smiling, asked her to tell him everything, for she could trust him. For a while, Chloe still doubted, but then she told him absolutely everything about the 3 years she spent in marriage with Kirill. She explained that he hadn't touched her on more than one occasion, and had just left her completely alone in the small bedroom, just as their wedding night was about to be their first. All the servants of the house simply ignored her, and if she didn't ask for food herself, of course no one would even serve her. The girl never attended the social events that took place almost every weekend, and instead was just locked in her room. When Roland heard this, he was very surprised and incredibly angry about the whole thing. He even wanted to hit that man very hard at that second. But then suddenly Chloe said that she wasn't pretty enough to join him, so it was only natural that she stayed always home alone. When she remembered her father saying that she was devoid of beauty and charm, and that she was the worst girl on the planet, he also talked about how if she didn't get married right now, it would never happen again, and also for her to remember that because he married her despite all her faults, and she should never cross her husband. Closing his eyes, Chloe said his new wife was a beautiful blonde with green eyes. She also, holding back tears, said that it was quite obvious that he had filed for divorce from a girl like herself. Roland listened to her arguments for a while longer, but afterward told her to listen to him carefully, and when looking directly into her eyes began to assert that she was very beautiful. He also added that if she wasn't so beautiful, he definitely wouldn't have been so stunned by her. The man spoke sincerely and said that he had never seen people like this before, so he asked that she believe what he tells her. She is really beautiful. Roland said her brown hair and eyes and rosy cheeks were all so perfect that even the roses he brought her as a gift would never compare. When Chloe heard this, she was very surprised. She wanted to say something, but he stopped her and said that he didn't want to hear any objections. The man looked very serious and asked that she never speak like that about herself again. He also added that words are like magic. What she says becomes reality in the end. And the man said that even after all this, she still probably can't believe his words. So he wants to believe in them himself and talk about how beautiful she is many times a day, so that one day she will believe in them too. He stroked her head and told her that if that was the case, he would start the very next day to raise her self-confidence. Roland also said he wants to start by making sure she is fully fed and well-nourished. Chloe just sat there crying for a while longer. After that, she started wiping away her tears, saying she was okay with it. And in the end, he really kept the promise he made to her. He didn't force her to do anything she didn't want to do, and he was always there for her, supporting her in any way he could. But it still bothered the girl a great deal, for she thought he must be incredibly busy with the allotment of his territory and his own business. She realized that he must have more urgent duties than just walking around the garden with her. Yet even when she tells him this, he still joins her for walks and lunches, even when he's incredibly busy with work. He keeps telling her that he wants to really be around her, and over time, Chloe has realized that he really is an incredibly kind man. Soon after the walk, they went to the dining room, and as soon as they went in there, the girl saw that on the table, there was an incredible variety of different dishes and desserts. When Chloe saw all this, she was very shocked, and said that it was very large scale. She didn't expect that he would be able to ask the cook to prepare so many dishes for her alone. He moved closer to take his seat and also said that he didn't know what she liked from the food, so he had the chef prepare a varied menu. He held out his hand to her and told her to go ahead and sit down. Chloe hesitated for a while, but soon took a seat right in front of him. Roland immediately inquired what she liked best. The girl hesitated and didn't know if she could choose at all, or what she should choose. She surveyed the table with a glance for a while, and said that in that case she would choose one chocolate dessert for herself. She probably didn't know what it even tasted like. It looked incredible, though. The man then took the plate in his hands and slid it closer to her, telling her to try it if she wanted to. For a while, Chloe was still hesitating, but after that she tasted the first spoonful of this delicious dessert and said that it tasted incredible. She looked at Lord and said she had never tasted anything like this before in her life, and she loved it all immensely. He was at this moment eating some strange consistency from his glass, and when he saw the surprised look on her face, he dropped down, wondering if she wanted to try it. Chloe immediately apologized and said that she hadn't meant for him to share with her, but Roland held out a spoon to her, saying it was perfectly fine, and asked that she try it. She looked surprised at the spoon that was reaching straight for her mouth, and the man explained that he had always wanted to try it that way with his wife. Such a confession even made him a little embarrassed. However, the girl still tasted the jelly he held out to her and said that it was a very good dish. Then she took and broke off a small piece of her dessert, and then she held it out for the man to taste. When Roland saw this, he was very surprised, and she, in turn, asked him to let her do something for him. After all, they are husband and wife, and should take care of each other. He hesitated for a while. He wondered if he could afford it, but then he opened his mouth and tasted the dessert. At that moment, Chloe felt that everything was absolutely right. She felt the most genuine happiness she had never felt before, and she couldn't even contain her laughter when Roland almost dropped a piece of food from his mouth. And so since that day, it's been a full 2 months since they've been living married life. Chloe, as was her habit, was sitting in her room reading a new book when suddenly Roland came to her. She immediately put it aside and asked him what he wanted. He came closer to her, asking if she would like to go on some excursion with him the very next day. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. After all, she used to stay at home all the time and never went out, and suddenly he invited her to a tour. Of course she agreed, and soon they were both packed. Some of the servants came outside to escort them, and Gaston, bowing, told them to be careful as they walked. Chloe, smiling goodbye, said they would be sure to be careful, and said goodbye to them. Lord Roland ended up giving her not just a tour, but a picnic as well. Their destination was a field on his property, where he wanted to take her to show her the beautiful views. In order to save money and not lead a whole carriage, they sat on one horse, quite close to each other. Chloe even began to feel a little worried, because they had not been alone for a long time. They continued to drive further and further away, when suddenly the man turned to her and told her to pay attention somewhere to the side. The girl immediately turned there and saw an incredibly beautiful view of the clearing and the mountains in the distance. She shrieked a little in admiration and couldn't take her eyes off it the whole time. The man was pleased that she liked it, for he realized that she had probably never seen anything like it in her life. They drove on. Then Roland pointed somewhere to the side and told her to look at a beautiful little rabbit. The girl couldn't find it right away, but when she did, she said it was really him. He pointed somewhere else in the depths of the forest, saying that there was also a forest lion there. When Chloe saw him, she was even a little frightened, for she had never seen such wild animals before. They rode for a while longer, and the girl kept looking around. After that, she pointed sideways at the plant that was there and asked if he could see what she was seeing. He said that it was quite true, and he too could see this beautiful flower called lavender. Soon afterward, they began to gallop even faster, and the wind was blowing them so hard that the girl thought she would lose her hat. He saw. From the very beginning, of course, Chloe was very worried. However, the places they visited were so new and interesting to her that she soon forgot about all the nerves. At that moment, the whole world seemed to her as if it were glowing. Soon they came to a small clearing that was planted with a variety of flowers, and finally stopped. The newlyweds shared a bedspread and immediately opened their picnic set, for they were already quite hungry. Chloe immediately took to her sandwich and was incredibly delighted with how the day was going. Sometime lively afterward, she said that it was just an incredibly delicious dish. He agreed with her, of course, and said that it was not for nothing that he had hired a cook of the best class after all. Roland also added that after all, he didn't regret taking the man out of the capital, because it was indeed the right decision. Chloe at this moment reflected on the fact that the cook was certainly part of the reason. However, at Arnal Manor, she always had to eat lunch and dinner completely alone. And thinking back to those times, it was the worst part of life on that estate for the girl.